Hey, folks. Oh, good. You're back. You got in, Kai Cheng?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was having some technical trouble.
No problem. We're just hanging out here with our cameras and audio off until, there's my alarm, the workshop starts and the video starts.
Fantastic.
Well, they're going to start playing a live video now. So you want to turn off.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome to Crear, Résister, Transform, a festival for feminist movements. We invite you to join us in creating a space that invites and challenges us all to operate from a place of courage, curiosity, and bravery. We have live language interpretation available in this session. Look to the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You will see an icon of a globe, which reads, if you're reading an English interpretation, click on it and select the language you would like to receive interpretation in. So if you'd like interpretation in English, click on English. We also have closed captioning available in this session. Look on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and you'll see an icon which in English reads Live Transcript. Click on it and you will have the option to show or to view the full transcript. You can also change the size of the text. To do this, click on Subtitle Settings and change to large. If you would like to change your name, click on the Participants button at the top of the Zoom window. Hover your mouse over your name in the participants list on the right-hand side and click on Rename. Enter the name you'd like to appear in the Zoom meeting and click on OK. We invite you to join the global AWID membership family. And to do this, visit our website, www.awid.org, and click to learn more about why you should become an AWID member. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Bonjour et bienvenue à Crear, Résister, Transform, un festival pour les mouvements féministes. C'est avec joie que nous vous accueillons à cet événement et vous encourageons à nous rejoindre dans les activités du festival qui auront lieu tout au long du mois de septembre. Nous vous invitons à nous rejoindre et à créer un espace qui nous invite à faire preuve de courage, de curiosité et de bravoure. Dans cette activité, nous avons une interprétation simultanée disponible en plusieurs langues. Dans la barre de menu en bas de l'écran, cliquez sur Interprétation. Cliquez ensuite sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Pour n'entendre que la langue interprétée, vous pouvez cliquer sur Muter l'audio original. Nous avons également des sous-titres disponibles en anglais. Dans la barre de menu en bas de l'écran, cliquez sur Transcription en direct. Cliquez ensuite sur Montrer sous-titres. Pour lire la transcription complète, vous pouvez cliquer sur Voir la transcription complète. Et pour changer la taille du texte, cliquez sur Paramètres de sous-titres et choisissez Large. Pour changer votre nom après être entré dans une réunion Zoom, cliquez sur le bouton Participant en bas de la fenêtre Zoom. Ensuite, faites passer votre souris sur votre nom dans la liste de participants à droite de la fenêtre Zoom, puis cliquez sur Renommer. Tapez le nom que vous voulez voir apparaître dans la réunion Zoom et cliquez sur OK. Encore merci de votre participation. Nous vous encourageons à partager vos réactions et vos commentaires sur les réseaux sociaux en utilisant le hashtag Feminist Festival et taguez l'AWID si vous pouvez. Nous vous invitons aussi à rejoindre la famille mondiale des membres de l'AWID. Pour ce faire, vous pouvez visiter notre site web à l'adresse www.awid.org et cliquer sur « En savoir plus sur pourquoi devenir membre de l'AWID ». Merci et profitez du festival.
Bienvenidos al festival Crear, Résister, Transform. AWID está comprometida con la creación de un espacio virtual que nos invite y desafíe a todos a funcionar desde un lugar de valentía, curiosidad, generosidad y responsabilidad compartida. Les invitamos a crear conjuntamente con nosotros espacios libres de acoso y violencia. Por favor, descarguen y revisen los principios de participación para el festival en awid.org/festival 2021. Tenemos disponible interpretación a distintos idiomas en vivo. Esto varía según cada sesión. Para activarla, en su menú de control, seleccionen el icono de Interpretation, elijan el idioma que quieren escuchar. Para escuchar solamente el idioma interpretado, seleccionen Mute Original Audio, silenciar el audio original de forma que solamente escuchen la interpretación en el idioma español si este es el que desean. También contamos con subtitulado disponible en inglés únicamente, pero si lo desean activar, en los controles para la reunión hagan clic en subtitulado en vivo, Live Transcript. Después hagan clic en Show Subtitle, en mostrar subtítulos. Para ver el subtitulado completo, hagan clic en View Full Transcript, ver subtitulado completo. Para cambiar el tamaño del texto, hagan clic sobre Subtitle Settings, ajustes de subtítulos y cámbienlo a grande, large. Si desean cambiar cómo aparece su nombre en Zoom, pueden hacerlo también. Para cambiar su nombre, después de entrar a una reunión de Zoom, hagan clic en el botón Participantes, en la parte de arriba de la ventana de Zoom. Después, deslicen el ratón sobre su nombre en la lista de participantes, que está a la derecha de la ventana de Zoom, y hagan clic sobre Renombrar. Escriban el nombre con el que quieren aparecer en la reunión de Zoom y hagan clic sobre OK. Lo más importante, únanse a AWID. Al unirse a AWID se suman un proceso organizativo feminista mundial, un poder colectivo surgido del trabajo entre movimientos y basado en la solidaridad. Ingresen a nuestro sitio web awid.org, membresía, para escuchar las razones por las cuales deberían ser parte de la membresía de AWID, o escríbanlos a membership@awid.org. Gracias y continúen disfrutando el festival Crear, Resistir, Transform.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're connecting from. Welcome, welcome to the AWID Festival. This is the session on Prison Isn't Feminist, exploring the impact and alternatives to reliance on police and incarceration. My name is Maggie. I'm AWID's communication strategist, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's brilliant facilitators of this session, Chanelle Gallant and Kai Cheng. Chanelle has been active in grassroots movements for sex worker rights and racial justice for 20 years as an organizer, movement strategist, trainer, fundraiser, writer, and speaker. She's on the leadership team for Showing Up for Racial Justice, co-founded the Migrant Sex Workers Project in Toronto, and has worked with sex work organizations locally and internationally. Her writing on the political intersections of sexuality and social justice have appeared in dozens of publications and anthologies. Most recently in Beyond Survival and Pleasure Activism. Be sure to check that out. She is the queer femme eldest daughter of a single mom and jubilant Christian abolitionist based in Toronto, Canada. We'll also have with us Kai Cheng Thom, master's in somatic coach, consultant, and conflict resolution professional based in Toronto. She's also the award-winning author of 5 books in various genres, including the essay collection, I Hope We Choose Love. Kai Cheng works with individuals and groups to support transformative change. She loves lasagna and transformative justice. So take it away, Chanelle and Kai. The floor is all yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to be here with all of you. And thank you so much. Yes, that's for me as well, for the introduction. Yay, Chanelle, what an honor to be presenting with you. Today, we will be presenting on why prison isn't feminist and abolition alternatives to the prison industrial complex and building bridges between the sex worker rights movement or the sex work decriminalization movement and the feminist prison abolition movement. Before we jump into our substantive content, though, I have an engagement exercise to bring, and we'll bring a few more of these throughout the presentation to make sure that everyone is feeling engaged and like you can respond to us and learn and reflect in the way that works best for you. So this is my first prompt for you. When we say the words sex work decriminalization now, I'm going to type that into the chat. Decriminalize sex work. Now, what is the first emotion that comes up in your mind? And then I'm just going to ask you to type it into the chat in whatever language you prefer. When I say decriminalize sex work now, what is the first emotion that comes up for you? Okay, I see happiness, relief, finger snaps, safety. Okay, all right. I see this is a crowd that might be somewhat familiar with the decriminalizing sex work movement. I see a yes, struggle. Thank you for that. Yeah, really welcoming this diversity of emotion and perspective here. Thank you. Excitement. Yeah. So I'm going to invite you to just keep on typing those in as they come up for you. If you have something to share, again, whatever language is your preference is completely wonderfully welcome. Why did we do this exercise? I think partly for us to get a sense of, okay, where are people in their journeys through feminism, feminist practice, and the topic of sex work decriminalization. And also to show that there can be like a big range of emotions and experiences with sex work decriminalization. Even those of us who nominally are familiar with the decriminalizing movement sometimes will struggle to, I mean, I will speak for myself, I struggle sometimes to really place it into the larger context of feminist organizing and anti-oppressive social justice movement. So thank you so much. I see that folks are typing more into the chat. That's just wonderful. Like I said, activities. And in the meantime, I'm going to open up our slideshow and turn it over to the amazing Chanelle Gallant, one of the smartest women that I know.
That is an extremely high compliment coming from you, Kai Cheng.
I know a lot of smart women.
You do, and you are one. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all. I've been a fan of AWID for years, and this is my first time attending and presenting. So I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers for just modeling a really badass intersectional internationalist feminism. That I deeply admire and I'm so pleased to be a part of. So we're going to start out with, just getting a little bit clarity on the goals. We want to be clear about what we're doing here today. So I can see the slides and I want to make sure everyone else can see the slides too. So if you want to just put in the chat, if you can see them, just to make sure that the tech is all going. Okay, great. Okay, great. So we're all good. So, okay. So the goals for today, we want to build solidarity between, like Kai Cheng was saying, between women's movement activists, sex workers movements, and the movement to abolish police, prisons, and all forms of criminal punishment. And we're going to get into why we think that's important. The second one is we want to illuminate some of the particularly racist and colonial impacts of what we call carceral feminism on women, migrants, and people of color. Actually, and specifically on sex workers. So, you know, what we're doing is we're using sex workers, and in particular migrant sex workers, in this piece to illustrate some of the forms of violence that women face that are interpersonal and state violence, and sex workers kind of exist at that intersection, and really sex worker movements help push us toward solutions that deal with both forms of gender-based violence, that recognize both interpersonal forms of gender-based violence, which is often called, you know, intimate partner violence or domestic violence, but also that create the space to recognize state violence against women and how we deal with that. You know, how do we deal with interpersonal violence without intensifying state violence against women? And sex workers are the perfect, you know, sex workers, I think the movement just modeled give us a perfect opportunity to look at both. And the third goal is to build some skill and knowledge around non-carceral approaches to gender-based violence, specifically against sex workers. But, you know, our philosophy is that if we created solutions to violence against sex workers, all women would benefit. That those solutions would need to transform society in such a way that all women would benefit if we created solutions to violence against sex workers. And now I think I'm passing it back to you, Kai Cheng.
I just managed to get our notes on my phone, so I can show the slides on my computer and look at my notes on my phone.
Great, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so we want to make sure that we are doing our best to respond to the wisdom and curiosities of people in this particular workshop. So I'm inviting folks to take a second to think of any questions that you have about carceral feminism, or pro-sex worker feminism, and then type them into the chat. We're not going to answer all your questions right away, but it will be really helpful to keep them in mind as we go through the presentation, and we will try to answer them as best we can over the next hour or so. So if you have any questions about pro-sex worker feminism or carceral feminism, please feel free to type them into the chat now. And if you don't have questions, but you have strong feelings, those are also welcome.
Can you tell that Kai Cheng has a background in counseling? Your strong feelings will always be welcome. In
Every part of you is welcome here.
I never say that.
You were also once a counselor, Chanelle.
I was.
Which is a great segue to our bios.
Who we are.
Okay, you first, Chanelle.
Okay, so, you know, just to say expand a little bit on my bio. So I have been an activist in sex worker and racial justice movements for about 20 years. I've played a lot of different roles because I really see myself as someone who is fundamentally an activist movement worker. I want to strengthen movements for social, racial, and economic justice. And I've done that in a lot of different kinds of ways. I come from a poor single parent family, and that has shaped a lot of my understanding of power and violence. And I have spent the last about 7 years working on issues related to migrants in the sex trade, along with Elaine Lamb, my close friend and comrade here in Toronto. And we are currently co-authoring a book together on non-carceral responses to migration, migrant sex work, and human trafficking. And I'll pause there and pass it to you, Kai Cheng.
Thanks, Chanelle. That's great that you're writing a book. I know I'm really excited about this because also one of the questions in the chat is about, are there books to read about carceral feminism or pro-sex worker feminism, or both? Oh, and I see Elaine has joined us. Speak of the...
Elaine just joined us. Welcome, Elaine. I just mentioned you.
Hi, Elaine. Great to see you here. So I'm Kai Cheng Thom. I am formerly, as Chanelle mentioned, a clinical social worker and youth and family counselor. I spent most of that time working in the public sector with queer and transgender young people and their families, and also was to various degrees engaged in social activist movements throughout that time. I have since shifted away from counseling practice to working as a professional coach, mostly for activists and nonprofit workers, and a conflict resolution practitioner. So I mediate conflicts mostly within activist organizations, because there seems to be a lot of conflict in activist organizations. I don't know if that's anyone else's experience. Something that I'm particularly interested in is working through ideological conflict, which brings me to the feminist movements and sex worker rights movements. As many of you are probably familiar, there's been a lot of conflict in the past between different types of feminism over the issue of sex worker liberation and prison abolition, and that's partly what brings me here, because I have like a deep desire to see us work through that conflict as feminists and find a better way of moving forward.
Yes, same, definitely same. So which brings us to the problem. Why do we need this workshop? Why are we here? And the problem is, oh, you know what? That's an old slide.
Oh.
Can you hit refresh?
I
wonder if that will do it. No?
You know what? I'm going to end the show and go to a different set of slides then.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Chanelle, and I will figure out this.
Okay, I'm just going to also text, I'm going to, there, I just sent you a link to this current slides. Okay.
Oh, perfect,
so,
thanks.
The problem that we want to talk about today, the problem that we feel like we're grappling with, is violence against women that is both interpersonal and state. So, you know, this workshop is about gender-based violence, and very often women are left out of the conversation on state violence, and the focus is very much on interpersonal, family, and domestic violence. But obviously, it's very dangerous to women to leave women out of the conversation about the impacts of surveillance, border security, policing, and prisons. Not just whether or not those are effective at dealing with interpersonal violence, but also as forms of violence, gender-based violence themselves. So we're using migrant sex workers as an example because they are a group of people who are caught between the risks of high rates of interpersonal violence, gender-based violence in their personal lives, whether that's from clients or from spouses, and state violence by police and border security. And that is because migrant sex workers live in the crosshairs of multiple political and economic systems, systems of border control, systems of capitalist exploitation, the devaluation of women's lives, bodies, and labor, control over their reproductive capacities, all of these things. You know, migrant sex workers are at the intersection of, they're often low income women of color who have crossed borders in order to survive, follow their dreams in some cases, make a living, support their families, etc. But the primary state response to migration, to sex work, and to violence has been to generate a moral panic around all forms of sex work, but in particular, all forms of sex work, but really specifically the kinds of sex work that, that women of color are engaging in, and migrant women of color in particular, to create a moral panic, to conflate it with sex work and frame it all as human trafficking and treat it all as a criminal justice issue. And rather than to look at the structural causes of both interpersonal and state violence, the state frames it all as a form of harm coming from sex work. It's all seen as trafficking, and they just bring to bear more surveillance, more police, more prisons, and then that actually increases state violence from law enforcement, but it also increases interpersonal violence because it increases the precarity of women, it increases their vulnerability to clients, to abusive spouses, It increases their risk of detention and deportation by border security agencies, and it excludes a whole swath of women from human rights, public services, labor protections, and it increases the risks of violence and debt bondage. So the state response to violence actually increases violence, debt bondage, and human trafficking against sex workers. So this is a real problem, right? This is something that is increasingly a problem as well, because, you know, in 2020 alone, the UN reported that I think there were 81 million migrants, 81 million people moved, across borders in 2020. And of those, many women migrants are going to choose that their best or only economic option is sex work. And yet this is criminalized, both their migration and their sex work. That is it for that. So I think I'm going to pass it back to you now, Kai Cheng.
Thank you. Awesome. So I am going to invite us to do a visualization activity. So because I am like the wooey counseling person in this duo. So I'm going to invite you, if you are comfortable, to close your eyes, maybe shift around in your seat and get more comfortable. If you don't want to close your eyes, that's totally okay. You can also just let them focus on a neutral spot in the room, wherever you are. Maybe take a long breath in and a longer breath out. Yeah. Maybe another nice deep breath and get a sense of how you're feeling in this moment, noticing your body, noticing your breathing, maybe noticing how your breath is a bridge from the outside of your body to the inside of your body. Following that bridge into your imagination, I'm inviting you to think about a world where sex workers have the full access to human rights and to labor rights that they deserve. So a world where there are sex workers, where there are people engaged in erotic labor, the adult entertainment industry, but who are fully given the complement of access to labor rights and human rights. I'm just asking you to consider what might have to be different about such a world. In a world where sex workers were free and had access to, for example, reproductive care and reproductive choice. What might have to be different about this world and how we view and give and grant access to reproductive care, reproductive control? What might be different about a world where sex workers have access fully to bodily and sexual autonomy, where sex workers were approached by clients and the law with the full understanding that they are able to choose and have the right to choose what physical acts they engage in and which they don't wish to? What would be different in a world where sex workers had access to unions, to health and safety protections, where sex workers were entitled to decide which work they wanted to take on, which work they wanted to decline, where sex workers had job security and protection to take days off, to have parental leave, to have benefits, even while working independently or as contractors. What might this world look like? And if this world was different for sex workers, how might it be different for everyone else as well? Chanelle in a moment might be about to talk to you about trickle up theory, the notion that when we address the needs of the most marginalized, then the needs of the collective as a whole are also addressed. So I just invite you to think about whether you have been involved in the erotic industry or not as a worker. What might be different for you in a world where sex workers were free? What might be different for you?
I love that question. I invite folks to put your thoughts into the chat. How would the world be different for you? Because how would the whole world have to be different if sex workers had, like Kai Cheng was saying, access to bodily autonomy, to care, to unions, to safety and protection, reproductive choice?
Thanks, Chanelle. Yeah, so coming out of that visualization, opening your eyes, maybe stretching, giving yourself a little shake, and yeah, typing into the chat as Chanelle invites us. What would be different for you in a world where sex workers had full access to labor and human rights? I see less stigma, more respect. No fear, darling. I'm getting a little teary thinking about that. More justice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I will just say, I think, for me specifically, I think that in a world where sex workers had all those labor rights, like I, as an independent contractor, would also have more job security, even when not working in the adult industry. Hey, I would have the ability to receive healthcare without being afraid that my gender identity or any of my labor experiences would impact my access to care. Chanelle, what would be different for you in a world where sex workers were free?
I think there are so many things, because I think everyone would have to have access to be honest, if sex workers were free, we'd have to have things like universal services or universal basic income, because that's what we need so that people can decline sex work or choose it. We need to have a world where people have their needs met without having to engage in work that they don't want to, if they don't want to. So for me, I would envision immediately a massive, like all the boats lifting in the water, because everyone would have access to their, like no one would be faced with starvation if they weren't. That's what it would look like. For me,
Yeah.
what it would look like for me.
No one would face the starvation because they
we would have to
wouldn't want to or
eliminate
weren't able to work. Yeah.
Freedom
would
for
have
sex
to.
workers would mean we would have to eliminate poverty. Yeah.
We really would. I'm seeing some beautiful stuff in the chat too. Like, I'll have access to trans-specific healthcare. Yes. Basic universal income, 100%. It would be less of an issue because it would help normalize the idea of erotic services, and within queer dream world, it would have a ripple effect on other areas. Yes. I see retraining of all service providers. Yes. A lot of love. Yes. And Nicole, you've written something so interesting, and I think we should talk about it a lot because it's so important. Being able to charge the Johns for abuse. So yeah, I mean, in one version, or maybe a few different versions of this world where sex workers had access to rights, we would be able to charge Johns for abusive behavior. Now, Chanelle and I are about to do some work around connecting sex work decriminalization with prison and police abolition. And so, in our vision of a world where sex workers were free, there also probably wouldn't be police. And so we would have to have a different way of responding to harm. But I think this question is at the crux of what we were talking about today. And so I'm really glad you brought it up. I think I'm passing it back to you now, Chanelle.
Sure. I think that is the crux of the problem, and I think why so much of abolitionist feminism comes from women of color in particular, is because of the ways that women of color have to deal with both the dangers of patriarchal violence that comes from men, but the problems as well of racist state violence on the other hand. And between that rock and a hard place, how do we ensure women's freedom and safety and dignity? And that's the problem, right? So when there's situations of violence, how do we deal with it without intensifying the racism and the state that comes through the state violence, that comes through the state? So what we're going to talk about is an approach that is called abolitionist feminism, which is a different way of looking at harm and a different way of looking at safety, rather than through a lens of crime. And so we're going to describe that a little bit, and then we're going to get into a bit of like, what are some of the solutions that come out of abolitionist feminism? So I feel like we can both do a bit of this. Hey, Kai Cheng, I'll kick it off. Okay. So to start with, this isn't a formal definition. This is just based on Kai Cheng and I's understanding of what abolitionist feminism means to us. The belief that women's freedom, safety, and power come from strong communities where women are respected and have what they need to thrive, not prisons, police, war, imperialism, or borders. So this means, for example, as a lot of us will already understand, we're not going to improve the conditions of women by waging war in Afghanistan. Do we improve the conditions of women by traumatizing men through prison? Does that reduce domestic violence? Like, it's looking at harm in a really different way. And it depends on the social, economic, ecological, this is also part of it because of the relationship between climate change and violence against women, and racial justice and equity. Abolitionist feminism is anti-imperialist, and it is also transnational. Want to jump in, Kai Cheng?
Sure. Yeah, I'm just going to gently remind folks to mute if you're not speaking, so that we minimize sound disruption and maximize accessibility. Yeah, Chanelle, you've spoken to looking at violence in a different way and looking at responding to harm with a different lens from the lens of crime. And I think I might just want to bring in, why also do we want to do that from a generalist standpoint, right? Like when we think about sex workers, or like sex work rights, we know that the police are the locus of most of the violence towards sex workers, the police of the criminal justice state, that is. But in general, of course, I think it's important to bring into this discussion that in most colonial contexts, so places like North America, Oceania, pretty much most of the world, police and prisons are a tool of the racist settler colonial state. So as many Black feminists and social justice organizers remind us, police are actually responsible for, and have been for centuries now, for controlling populations of Black folks in the United States and worldwide. Here in so-called colonial Canada, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were a creation largely to control and oppress and restrict Indigenous populations, and played a large role in carrying out the cultural and literal genocide that has occurred here in this nation state by removing children from Indigenous homes. So historically and contemporarily, we know that police are much more a weapon of violence toward people of color and migrants primarily. And I personally, and I think you would agree probably, Chanelle, don't believe that like a racist tool of violence can be used to further the liberation or freedom of women in general. And the same holds true for the prison industrial complex. So if we look at who is in prisons, who makes up the prisoner population, we can see in a vast majority of colonial contexts, it is overwhelmingly Indigenous people, Black folks, and people of color. Prisons generally do not tend to address issues of violence or harm. They instead serve as a form of population control, and some would argue in abolitionist feminism, a form of an extended form of the slavery state or the enslavement state, because prisoners are forced to work for like reduced or no wages at all. So when we think about why do we want to link sex worker feminism with prison abolitionist feminism and police abolitionist feminism, it is because there is a commonality between sex worker communities and communities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color worldwide, migrant communities. The police do not help us, that the prison industrial complex doesn't help us. It instead creates more harm, more fear, more restriction. And of course, sex workers, like the majority of sex workers in the world are migrants, Indigenous folks, Black folks, and people of color. So there's a powerful intersectionality there as well. I think that's what I will say on that. Maybe I will also add that we also really support the decriminalization of sex work and all forms of women's bodily autonomy. So the actual experiences, needs, and survival of sex workers, especially those in colonized and invaded countries, are preferenced above morals about sexual dignity and national image. And so I like to say, there's often for non-sex workers that I meet this like idea of like, oh, those Johns are bad. And I will just say that having met many Johns, sex work clients in my life, mostly Johns are like your dad and your uncle, which is to say Johns are mostly normal people who want to buy erotic services for fun, and not just men also, right? Like the majority are men, but also a significant number of buyers of sexual services who are of all genders, many of whom are of various abilities and various ages. And we support the decriminalization of sex work because we also support the decriminalization of sex, like the destigmatization of sex. And the needs and survival of sex workers is more important, we believe, than the idea that Johns are somehow all this evil category of people that need to be punished and brought to justice. Mostly, Johns are people who want to have sex for money. Some are abusive, certainly, and this is true of all people who are engaged in sexual activity, is that some are abusive and some are not. And the idea that somehow women are being besmirched, that their innocence is being taken away, or that they're being that there are some that sex working women are somehow a symbol of national image or national pride that then need to be avenged, to us just isn't relevant to like what sex workers actually need, which is economic empowerment, labor empowerment, and bodily autonomy. All right, I will move us to the next slide and pass it back to you, Chanelle. I hope I'm doing that right.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I want maybe I'll say a couple words on this, and then let's do one of the little our next engagement.
Yeah.
Because I would love to hear from folks, but I also just want to add a little clarifying thing. First of all, thank you for that, Kai Cheng. I feel like that just dove us into the anti-racist reasons why we are abolitionists, and why we believe in the abolition of police and prisons and border security and surveillance and all forms of carceral punishment as a way of responding to gender-based violence and pursuing women's freedom. Because those two goals, the fight against white supremacy and the fight against patriarchy, are not in competition with each other. Those are, we see feminist abolition as a way that those goals work together. And a little clarifying point I want to make is that feminists who believe in the prohibition and criminalization of the sex industry refer to themselves as abolitionists. This is appropriative. It's the appropriation of the lineage and power and analysis and movements of Black people against slavery. It is inappropriate, it's anti-Black, and I don't use the word abolitionist to refer to people who support criminalization because I think it's racist. And it's especially inappropriate because the criminalization of sex work disproportionately harms Black women. And so I will never use the language of abolition for anything other than to talk about the way it is currently used by Black abolitionists to mean the abolition of the prison industrial complex. So we are feminist abolitionists, and we're using it in a way that is consistent with how that term is designed to be used. And for us, that means that I'm going to read a bit of the slide for the interpreters, but I think we've already gone through it, which is that women's freedom and dignity cannot be achieved through racist systems of punishment, policing, borders, war, or surveillance, and that the impacts of criminalization are increased precarity and violence for sex workers, the extreme marginalization of migrant workers, more women in prisons, and a distraction from the true issues of labor rights, migrant rights, and women's bodily autonomy. We believe that vilifying male third parties, such as Johns, managers, and pimps in the sex industry, often relies on or worsens anti-Black and anti-Asian racism and is immaterial to improving the conditions of sex workers, or it harms sex workers of color who are seen as to be in need of rescue from the police. Nobody, we've said our point. We've made I think we've underlined that enough. Punishment of Johns, tricks, or clients, however people define them, fails to solve problems faced by sex workers, but also by all women. So who does this actually empower? All right, shall we do a little engagement?
Yeah, I'm going to actually stop the screen share for a moment so that we can see people's beautiful faces. Yay, beautiful faces. So that was a lot to digest, or maybe it wasn't for some of you because you're already very familiar with it. But the engagement question that we have for you now is, and I would love it if folks would either type into the chat or respond by unmuting and speaking aloud, is what, in your opinion, is the difference between punishment and justice? I'm going to type that into the chat as well. What is the difference between punishment and justice? Why are we asking this in the context of abolitionist feminism and sex work decriminalization? Because so often the response that sex work exclusionary radical feminists have is to problems in sex work is that they want to punish Johns with criminalizing laws. And we're trying to expand our thinking to a justice that is beyond punishment, which would better serve sex workers, Black folks, Indigenous folks, and people of color. Nicole, I see your hand is up.
Right, thanks for the opportunity. So you all got me thinking, because I did mention that, yes, the John should be charged for abusing persons. So maybe a way of restoring the dignity of the sex worker could be the way that the John could pay it forward, possibly. So maybe instead of locking them up, take them to a sensitization session and afterwards have them lead a session for other men to then share what they've learned and maybe edify other people.
I love that, Nicole. So this is like a restorative justice approach. It is about the community, and I would really push for it's the community of sex workers, right? Identifying the abusive John in question and having them do some learning and sharing about like what it means to be like someone who is changing abusive patterns. Yeah, Chanelle, any thoughts on that one?
Yes, I think the only thing I would say is that currently those are often mandated by the courts. And in that case, we don't see that being useful for women survivors. But where the courts are involved and it's just a condition of a condition of sentencing, but where there are opportunities for, and where I think where sex workers would want to have that, that accountability, I think that sounds great. I also like the idea of fines. I like the idea that people should actually have to pay restitution toward people that they have done harm towards. I think there can just be, we're going to come up to this soon, which is what are all the different non-carceral responses to harm that that people already use.
Absolutely. So, I think I would, like to take our thinking before, like to whet our appetites for that. Like, so something I often think about when it comes to sex work and Johns who are abusive is that in my experience, it's really not so frequent that like the idea is like, oh, the John should be charged and go to prison because that doesn't change anything. There's still going to be abusive Johns, right? But what sex workers have been doing for decades is having blacklists and like they share information. One shares information with others so that a John who is abusive is never able to hire a sex worker again. Now, this strategy is only somewhat effective because these lists have to be sort of managed in secret. But in a world where sex workers are really empowered and had unions, right? I think that this ability to stop people from becoming clients again until they have, maybe gone through some kind of like self-reflection or self-education program would be much stronger. And so it's things like this where we put the power in the hands of the sex workers. That is really exciting to me. I see there's so much in the chat. I just want to get to it. From Elaine, punishment is the excuse to cover up the control and oppression of women's bodies, migrant and women of color. Yeah, I really appreciate that, Elaine. Justice doesn't depend on a court sentence in prison. So that's kind of what we're talking about just now. Prison punishment is violent and often injustice. Punishment perpetuates cycles of violence, doesn't resolve anything really. Punishment can be accountability. There are obviously better ways to do punishments or not be called punishments. Justice is opportunities to be transformative, regenerative. Justice is the goal. Punishment is a violent response for violence. Justice involves transformation and finding communal solutions. Thanks, Chanelle, but it doesn't happen where I am. I hear you. So yeah, we're having some sharing and like some fruitful kind of differences here. Let's come back to that soon. +1 to Miriam, and yes to self-reflection and education. Thanks, everyone. Such an exciting discussion. I think this is back to you, Chanelle. Hey, or is it me now? I can't remember.
I think next I'm just looking at the next slide, the feminism we reject. I actually feel like we could probably skip that.
Okay.
And just go to the Abolitionist Feminist test and then open it up for a brainstorm and Skillshare.
Oh, can I really quickly comment on that?
Go for it. Whatever you want to. Go for it. Whatever you want to.
Thank you, my love. All right. So the feminism we reject, and this is probably going to be familiar to a lot of people. We just reject a feminism that is white and imperialist. That is sex work exclusionary, that is trans exclusionary or so-called gender critical, because it views sex workers and trans women as inferior and dangerous threats to women's rights, where we believe that trans rights and sex worker rights are central to women's rights as a whole. And I just wanted to quickly comment on what we call the anti-human trafficking industrial complex kind of feminism. So there is a very powerful and very well-funded model of feminism in the United States, based primarily in the United States, Britain, and other countries in the global north, that views the criminalization, stigma, and prohibition of sex work and sex workers as advancing women's rights. And we're seeing that hugely proliferated now with lobbying against companies such as Pornhub. We saw it earlier with the shutdown of websites such as Redbook and Backpage, which is not to say that those companies were ever themselves for sex worker or women's rights. Often they were sort of mixed or negative in many ways too. But what we see with the targeting of online companies or like other places or areas where sex workers are working is like a reduction in sex workers' ability to have agency over their own bodies and over their own lives and to make livings and livelihoods in the way that feels best to them in the moment. And we also see that the anti-human trafficking industrial complex does not replace lost sources of income for sex workers and actively also tends to increase the surveillance, arrest, and deportation of migrant sex workers in the global north. So I think it's particularly important to highlight this because this strain of so-called feminism is particularly vocal and dominant in well-funded spaces, and has been commented quite frequently in the contemporary media over the past month or two, perhaps most famously in an interview with Judith Butler in The Guardian a little while ago, maybe I think it was just last week, where people are sort of pointing out what is a surprising seeming alliance between certain forms of feminism and certain forms of white conservatism. Like this interesting alliance between feminists who don't like trans people and conservatives who don't like trans people, between feminists who don't like porn and conservatives who don't like porn, between feminists who want stronger anti-trafficking and surveillance laws that negatively impact people of color and migrants, and conservatives who want the same. And as Judith Butler mentioned in that interview in The Guardian, and as Chanelle and I believe, and has been said for quite some time by pro-sex work feminists, this is because this form of feminism is not actually a form of feminism at all. It aligns itself with fascism and is really in many ways serves to reinforce the supremacy and the wealth of white women in the name of women's rights. So I'm just going to speed past that, which brings us to the the abolitionist feminism test, which Chanelle and I have developed and are excited to share with you. So the test is pretty simple. But we like it because it is a tool for identifying what kind of feminism is at work in any particular organization, theory, or individual activist effort. And the question is this: does this feminist theory, project, organization, or activist try to solve women's problems by A, increasing the power of police and prison systems, or B, putting power in the hands of women, gender diverse people, migrants, and sex workers? So I will give a quick example of this. So should I name specific organizations? I will just say I will name one organization, which is the Polaris Project, based in the United States.
Fair game.
Yeah, well, they're very vocal right now. So the Polaris Project is an example of an organization that I would call a part of the anti-human trafficking industrial complex, which is to say they derive funding and power by championing supposed anti-human trafficking. But when we apply the abolitionist feminism test to the work of organizations like the Polaris Project, we look at A, do they increase the power of police and prison systems, or B, put power in the hands of women, gender diversity, migrants, and sex workers? And we can clearly see it's A. In the case of the Polaris Project, some of the initiatives that they're specifically working on include not only supporting the ongoing and increased criminalization of sex work, but the deputization of people such as taxi drivers, hotel managers, hotel cleaning workers, anyone who works in a public sphere, to surveil women traveling alone, women traveling with men, women drinking alone in a bar. I am not joking. These are some actual guidelines that particularly hotel workers in the United States are being encouraged to look for right now. Women traveling alone, women drinking alone in a bar, and using that as like a trigger to connect with the police and have people ad hoc investigated, stopped, or surveilled for supposed human trafficking. And so when we think about that and the impact it can have not only on sex workers, but on women as a whole, on women as a class, like not allowed to drink alone at a hotel bar, that's like my whole life, or it was before COVID. We see that there's like a real difference between a feminism that attempts to expand police and prison power versus a feminism that would maybe, for example, advocate for a universal basic income so that sex workers did not have to take on clients that they didn't want to take. Over to you, Chanelle.
Okay, let's do the group brainstorm, and then do you want to do the poll? Do you want to do the poll before or after the group brainstorm?
After, because I have yet to set up the poll.
Great. Okay, we're going to do a brainstorm. Will you, so the group brainstorm / Skillshare, this is participation time again, is we want to open up the chat for folks to share, given everything that you've, all the work that you've been involved in, what have you seen are alternatives to creating safety, rights, and power for women without reliance on surveillance, policing, prisons, or border security? That is the question. We've mentioned a few of them so far, right? We've talked about even just I mean, some of the things we've talked about include trans healthcare, eliminating women's poverty, but what are alternatives to creating safety, rights, and power for women without reliance on surveillance, policing, prisons, or border security? We would love to hear from you. I'm going to pause.
Indeed. The poll is ready whenever we want it, because Erin made it, not me.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin at AWID. Right on. So Michelle mentioned incorporating Indigenous ancestral knowledge and systems. Love that. Yes. Recognizing that sex workers engage in many forms of anti-trafficking work and the most effective. Thank you. Right. So how can we empower that work? Empowering communities to resolve issues that emerge. Love this. Yes. Restorative justice methods. Absolutely. Training feminist social workers. And again, another mention of restorative justice approaches. I'm wondering if I should leave some space, or I might ask Kai Cheng, someone who's, you're so skilled in this area. Can you say a little bit about what restorative justice is and what it is not, and why it is relevant in a conversation about ending gender-based violence without police and prisons?
I will do my best, but if you have thoughts, please also let me know. Restorative justice is, as many of you may know, a form of justice that is descended from traditionally indigenous forms of governance worldwide, though the type of restorative justice that is commonly practiced in North America and parts of Europe are based in North American specific indigenous traditions, as well as like Australian indigenous specific contexts rather. And restorative justice is relevant, I believe, to developing an abolitionist feminism, primarily because in some of its forms, particularly its original forms, places power for responding to violence and harm in the hands of the communities in which the harm took place. So restorative justice has three pillars. One of them is needs and obligations, the other is accounting for harms, and the third is community engagement. So really creating space for communities to actively participate. What we have right now in most colonial settler contexts is the colonial version of justice, in which for serious harms and crimes, supposed crimes, it is in Canada the Crown, or in America, like the federal government. Many places it's the federal government that holds responsibility and that has actually been offended against. It's not the survivor of the harm, and the survivor of the harm in most contexts has little to no ability to control the process, or to speak even into the process beyond what is demanded in terms of cross-examination, providing evidence, and that sort of thing. So restorative justice kind of has this focus on community engagement, and it's also non-punitive in nature. It is about the restoration of a healthy relationship, or a healthy way of being, a good way of being with one another. Now, there are limitations to restorative justice. Restorative justice, for example, has been institutionalized in many places in North America, and so is in some places conducted by the police, or is in some cases presided over by a white colonial court system, and also there are just general problems with some forms of restorative justice, like if one places power in the hands of a community and the community is not well equipped to respond to the needs of survivors, then what happens is, and sometimes it is the abuser's rights that get upheld and not so much the survivor. So, it's not a catch-all. It's not like an idealistic kind of magical solution. Neither is transformative justice. Restorative justice is sort of like abolitionist cousin. But what I would say the focus could be on here is like looking at what are the social conditions that lead to harm, and how can we use incidents of harm to identify what could be different. So if I think about like what is illuminated by a migrant sex worker being let's say, abused by a police person, that's an incident of harm. It tells us that the police are not the people who should hold migrant sex workers' safety in their hands. It tells us that migrant sex workers need to be consulted when it comes to like what does justice mean for them. So in so many cases, migrant sex workers are arrested and deported, and also abused in that process, supposedly in the name of their own protection. And really, what I would say the focus of restorative or transformative justice would be is like what is illuminated there is who needs to define what is safe for migrant sex workers. It's migrant sex workers themselves, and not the police or like a white woman, CEO or executive director of an organization that has nothing to do really with the lives of migrant sex workers. What about you, Chanelle?
Well, I just wanted to mention a comment in the chat. Someone who mentioned that also the process can be patriarchal and it can be hard to bring in sexual violence issues.
Yes, this is a commonly repeated theme in many communities where restorative justice has been made a centralized approach, is that in some small communities, Indigenous or otherwise, people who've traditionally held power are men, or the patriarchy. And so when sexual violence emerges, where most forms of sexual violence are perpetrated by men, then that system doesn't really work out so well. So power needs to be placed in the hands of women and trans people and gender diverse people. When we think about like what is restorative justice, I think sometimes it's important to think about like not just what is traditional, but also what is like adapted to the things, to the needs of the contemporary world, and also the changes that people are advocating, that marginalized people are advocating for within their own communities.
Yeah, and I think how I kind of think about abolitionist feminist responses to harm, including gender-based violence, is I think of it in two ways. I think of prevention and response. And when people think about justice, they often aren't thinking about things, and this is something I've really been taught by abolitionist feminists, to think about things like adequate housing, mental health care, broad health care, right? Access to food security, income security, that all of those things contribute to safer communities, right? The safest communities are not those with the most police, they're those with the most resources. So harm prevention looks like people having what they need to thrive. So what does that mean for women? If we're dealing with gender-based violence, I'm sure many people on this call can relate that very often what a survivor needs more than they need someone in their family dragged off to prison is housing. They need a housing alternative. They need safe housing for themselves or their children, or they need somewhere else for, say, an abusive family member to go live that isn't with them, for example. That's an abolitionist feminist response to gender-based violence. That's the prevention piece is around knowing that people have access to all of the things, like the resources they need. But then there's all the things, Kai Cheng, that you were talking about, like skilling up and training people in how to respond to situations of harm after the fact. Because the thing about police is they're only meant to be responsive. They're only there after the fact. And then they do an extremely horrible job on gender-based violence, notoriously terrible at dealing with violence against women, right?
Notoriously, it's true. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to the topic of sex work and human trafficking in specific, it's the police that tend to be first reached out to in the mainstream, and also in a lot of feminist quarters, right? Like, oh, it's the police, or like, oh, it's the law. And it's this interesting sort of double standard where in the violence against women sector, like the police are notoriously bad at, and the criminal court also notoriously bad at responding to domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And yet somehow
sexual violence,
when it comes to sex workers, it's special and different. And the response, like the lens of the response is punitive, that like somehow if we punish more perpetrators of harm, then the harm will stop, which sociological research bears out. It's never really been the case. And you're right, like where does harm thrive? Where does sexual violence thrive? It thrives in abuse. It thrives in isolation. And because of criminalizing laws around sex work, police and Johns both have, in many ways, a perfect opportunity to commit violence in isolation where it is unseen, right? And so it's the decriminalization and also all these sort of access to the basic determinants of health, social determinants of health, and social determinants of what I would call like human rights and freedom that really is most effective when it comes to folks being able to first not experience violence in the first place and to recover from it when violence does occur.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, you know, what we wanted to talk about here today was basically how if we can solve the problems of violence against sex workers if we, you know, invest in alternatives to prisons and policing for sex workers, then this generates solutions for all women who are experiencing gender-based violence. It generates solutions like, you know, an elimination of poverty, adequate housing, food security, childcare. Those are the strategies that actually support a reduction in violence against sex workers. And then that moves out, trickles up so that it reduces the possibilities of harm against all women. I want to hear from some more folks too in the chat. I mean, I feel like we just went deep into that, but I want to kind of pull back for a second and hear what other people are thinking right now about alternatives to police, prisons, and incarceration.
Nicole, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I want to ask a question because you all have given me lots to think about because I'm from the Caribbean and we don't discuss any of what you all just talked about in any huge way. But how do I then either broach the conversation with other feminists who don't feel that abolitionist feminism is the way to go, in that they're very gung-ho around punishing the person who does harm, because I even been trying to find a different word to use than perpetrator, because they want to really use this hard line against people who harm other people, and I get it, but it, as you all rightly have been saying, it doesn't shift anything. So I just want to know if, you know, what suggestions you all have around having this hard conversation.
Yeah. Oh, I love this question so much. Can I go, Chanelle? And then
Please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I think this really gets to the heart of something I'm interested in too, is like we have in the feminist movement such strong convictions, sometimes in different directions. And I think the first thing I would say as a practical tip is, for something that's worked for me, is to assume that whoever I'm talking to, who is gung-ho, as you say, about like punishment being like, I like to assume that it's very possible that they've experienced some harm in their own life, because as women, you know, we tend to, right? And so when we experience harm, or someone we love has experienced harm, it's easy, one comes to one's own political conclusions, and then it's very personal. And so I guess what I would say is, to like leverage relationship, like to be curious, like when I'm talking to someone who I really have a disagreement with around this issue, I assume that they have like a really like a personal reason maybe, and like ask like what really, like what do they believe like is the good of their approach, and like what should I consider as an abolitionist feminist that maybe I haven't thought of before, because I believe probably there's things I haven't thought of before, right? And there's also a lot of things I have, and you know, having listened to that person and let them, you know, kind of really give me their full view, and maybe been even a little bit changed by their view, I try to tell them mine, right? To see if they're interested. And use like my own personal experience as well, because I have a personal experience that leads me to where I am, and some of the experiences of the women I've worked with, not, you know, breaking confidentiality or anything, to really ask, like to go into like to validate it's okay. Like if we've been harmed or someone we love has been harmed, it's okay to be angry. Like it's okay to want even revenge. Like revenge is a natural human instinct. And my gosh, like sometimes I wish that perpetrators would be more punished. And then, you know, once I've validated this in myself and in other people, can really ask the question though, but does this change the problem? right? Like, does this solve the problem, and how does it do that? And if we look at the numbers of the people who are in prison and the numbers of people who are in prison for intimate partner violence, who then go on to recommit intimate partner violence after they leave prison, which is a high number, by the way, because what happens in prison, it's not like this box where people hang out in neutral. What happens in prison is they too tend to experience more violence, often of an intimate nature. And so when we say we put people in prison for doing intimate partner violence, sometimes what we're actually saying is, I want them to experience intimate violence as well, or more intimate violence than they already have. And so when we kind of gently bring these things up and we look at like, okay, but what would change the problem, right? Like, what would stop intimate partner violence from happening at all, or what would stop violence happening towards sex workers at all? Generally, if we go slowly and the person is actually somewhat curious, we get to at least a somewhat different answer. And I think this is a question of like long-term relationship building, right? Like, if we're deeply involved in the feminist movement, sometimes these conversations take time, and I'm willing to take like, whatever I can get in terms of making the shift happen. Yeah, I don't know if any of that was helpful at all, but I mean, I think the key takeaway that I always like is like to begin with the curiosity and to validate that people want punishment, and then to explore, does the wanting punishment and the creation of change actually align, or is it maybe different?
That was super helpful. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. I see lots in the chat, but I'm having some technical trouble. Chanelle, could you read the chat? Is it okay?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. It's really beautiful. And also just thank you for your question, Nicole. Yeah, it comes up a lot where people have that question, like, how are we going to move people away from punishment when there is, and I think I don't know if this is something that you mentioned, Kai Cheng, what you said, but I think I love what you said about basically listening and empathizing with where people are coming from and what's motivating that. The pain that's motivating that is real. The desire to have harm recognized as real. And I think eventually, once we've built that relationship with people, regrounding in, well, what is your ultimate goal? And if your goal is to keep women safe, then does it work? And that's what I always come back to. No matter how mad, how furious, how disgusted I am about the actions of someone who has caused harm, I have to come back to, does it work to punish them? And usually the answer is no. And I have a responsibility not to make people worse, not to make people who have caused serious harm against women or children worse, to come out with all of to take away all the things that actually reduce the likelihood of violence, which is like having a job, being connected to family, being, part of community. When people lose those things, that does increase their possibility of violence. And that's what I always try to come back to, both for myself as a survivor and with other survivors, is how can we get back to what we're actually rooted in, which is transforming violence. And that means we need alternatives. So, okay, the chat, love those, sound like a plan. These are powerful ways to address basic needs. Yes, thank you. So interesting, I'm loving this. I think changing social norms among men would be important, 100%. I.e. changing ways of thinking that encourage toxic behaviors towards women. Yes, and that I think is a really interesting piece around how do we change culture. Better integration of migrants within communities. Yes, no isolation, no separation. Yes, if we didn't have such racist immigration policy that created a separation between all migrants and very intensely around migrant sex workers, of course there's less violence. That isolation contributes to vulnerability to violence. I'm wondering about how to combat people with I think, punitive mindset. Yeah, her adverse to prevention and response. Those people who do not see benefit of supporting everyone. Hey, Nicole, totally with you on shifting feminist work in the Caribbean from punitive measures. I think sharing data from abolitionists to encourage dialogue is where I'm at. I love For Harriet's videos on YouTube. I also watch For Harriet. So For Harriet is a YouTube thinker, essayist that you can find on YouTube. Do you want to respond to any of those? I feel like there's a question that came up to you. What are methods you've seen that help process and channel the anger communally, since we usually learned violent ways to do so? Oh, these are such cool questions and comments. Thank you so much. Yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah, good. That's a good question. Of course, there's so much rage, so much anger around the kind of violence that people are dealing with. And yeah, how can we channel that communally? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on that, Kai Cheng?
I do. I mean, I think there is so much to be said about the power of collective trauma healing work. Like, I think a lot of the like colonial response to women who have experienced violence is like, go to therapy. And like, yes, I think everyone also should have like funded access to therapy if they want to. But there is also something that happens in the feminist movement, especially around like the anti-human trafficking industrial complex, where there's this feeling of like, oh, we're all together and we're fighting the people who have harmed us. And that's so powerful. Like, I think it's a big draw in many ways for people for some women to punitive feminism. And I think that some ways to channel that anger are like, to like maybe pull that away from like the political lobbying part and into like, what can women do for each other in terms of, for example, traditional healing, right? Like in many forms of Indigenous healing, there is like group process, group ritual. Like also, I'm just gonna like channeling like our organizing into, for example, women's self-defense training, right? Like a huge, like a huge stepping stone of like feminist organizing in the 1970s that I wish we would come back to, right? Like creating spaces for women to be angry, to be loud, to take up space, to process rage, to make art, like any kind of artistic, athletic, or like community building endeavor that isn't advocating for more prison building and stronger police power, I think is an excellent way to channel and process rage. And I think there's a lot of people working in the arts, in community building, in like spiritual traditions who have a lot to offer, you know, globally around this. So I would say anything that is about connecting people to a community of being angry together for a generative purpose is something that can be effective. And yeah, I think something that's I wanted to drop in as well is like another important factor, I think, is like maybe shifting societal attitudes towards sex is like a really important piece in achieving like sex worker rights and abolitionist feminism. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, and you know, just I think to pick up on what you were saying, Kai Cheng, around attitudes towards sex and sex workers' rights are really related. And so much violence against women and gender-based violence is excused and perpetrated through the lens of the accusation of some form of sexual deviance. She was a whore, she was a slut, she was asking for it in some way, or she stepped out in some way that's considered immoral, you know, whether that's a divorce, whether that's an unplanned pregnancy, or, you know, a pregnancy out of marriage, etc. It could be anything. It could be the kind of work she takes, the kind of hours she works, anything like this. And so the defense of sex workers, what it does is it defends women's rights generally to freedom and safety and respect, regardless of their sexuality. So changing attitudes around sexuality is definitely tied to the fates of sex workers in any given community, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see we're coming into the last 8 minutes. Hopefully we did what we set out to do. But in case we didn't, I will quickly throw up our last slide. To forward some of this thinking in your own work at home, wherever you are. So things that you can do. Is this me or you, Chanelle? Sorry.
No, that's great. Okay.
Yeah. Invest resources and political energy into non-carceral responses to harm. So restorative justice, women's self-defense, community building, transformative justice, like resource sharing, union building, like anything really that is about putting power in the hands of women and not in the hands of police. Great, you know, divest from carceral and sex work exclusionary feminist organizations, actions, and movements. This is key. I really believe that sex worker exclusionary radical feminism, and the anti-human trafficking industrial complex really are like aligned more with fascism than they are with feminism, because they really contribute to the dominance of like white women and white people in the global political sphere. And so divesting from those kinds of organizations and actions is important not only for sex workers, it's important for all of us who seek like a different kind of world. Direct resources and relationship building efforts towards women's rights and local sex worker rights organizers. And so by this, we mean like really looking at locally, who are the sex workers, because there usually are some who are actually doing organizing work to keep one another safe. And in a way that is about empowering one another, not empowering the police. Advocate for the decriminalization of women's bodily autonomy and survival, including sex work. So we really see, and this is something I wish was more linked in the mainstream, is the right to have sex, like with whomever one wants in a consenting way, including for money or not for money, and the right to have children or not have children. These things are extremely closely linked, and when we put them together, we have more power to fight for women's bodily autonomy, and to bring women's rights organizers, racial justice, and sex work rights organizers together to explore avenues of shared interest and solidarity. So this one is huge. I remember I went before COVID. I went to like a political rally where like some major labor rights organizers in the area of like food delivery, like, you know, because here in the global north, there's all these like food delivery apps, right? So drivers and cyclist delivery folks were gathering to unionize, and a lot of other unions and laborers and politicians who were into labor rights, or at least nominally into labor rights, were gathering. I also went. And you know, briefly mentioned sex work as like also like an avenue of solidarity for labor rights. Sex workers and food delivery workers actually have a lot more in common than one might think. And the room went dead. The room went silent. People looked away. Nobody wanted to talk to me. And I was like, oh, I see. And so that felt bad for me personally. But more importantly, because I'll be fine, was wow, like there is this like immediate lack of ability to build solidarity between the labor rights movement and the sex worker rights movement, and yet these movements have so much to offer one another. So really anything that you can do to forward that conversation and break down people's knee-jerk response to the sex work rights conversation, like, oh my God, that's so scary, I could never talk about that because it's about sex and sex terrifies me, you know, anything to build that conversation more into the labor rights movement or other forms of like human rights movements is very key. Okay, so that is our slides. And coming into the last few minutes, Chanelle, I wonder if there's any gems that you want to leave us with.
Oh no, I want to ask from the attendees. Would you please share in the chat your gems? Also, someone mentioned a workshop coming up, which sounds great, which is the Voices of Formerly Incarcerated Women, called Voices from the Front Lines, Bolstering Collective Power to End the Incarceration of Women Worldwide. Love that. So you can check that out on the AWID schedule. But please share in the chat, what are some gems for you? It's really useful for us to know just what landed and what you're going to continue to chew on or share with others. We'd love to hear from you. And then we're going to wrap. Okay, Elaine, thank you. Elaine, thank us both. Well,
purpose as a north, shifting from punishing to restoration, that it's okay to tend to the most base needs of the most marginalized. Forgot to ask what women who have been incarcerated due to killing their abusers is a very good question. Thinking of rituals to create to transform anger as a community.
Love it.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, thanks.
That's great. Those are beautiful gems. If anyone else wants to throw them into the chat, we'll be around for another couple minutes. And otherwise, we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I'm only scratching the surface of this question, Nicole, but like, yeah, so women have been incarcerated due to self-defense is another huge reason we need to overhaul this idea of criminal justice, right? Like it's yet another way in which policing and prisons do disservice to women and survivors.
We should also recommend that people check out, what's the organization, Kai Cheng? Survived and Punished.
Oh.
Yeah, so I recommend folks look up the work of Survived and Punished in the US, which is an organization that advocates around the rights, in particular of women of color who have been, because that's largely who gets criminalized for self-defense. Yes, and check out the work that they're doing and their understanding of the impacts of policing in prisons on women of color and Black women in particular. Because yes, like Kai Cheng, it's such an important form of state violence. So often the state violence that women experience is the criminalization of their self-defense. In particular, marginalized women, poor women and women of color.
We could talk about the overlap with the sex work communities that have also done self-defense and criminalized, right? Like that's, anyway, but that's maybe a conversation for another time.
Yeah.
It's so big. Yeah.
There was a question in the chat about where people can get the recording for this. Does anyone from AWID want to jump in?
The AWID's YouTube
you're already
account.
on it. You're already on it. The AWID's YouTube account. Awesome. I'm looking forward to. So please feel free to share this with others because we recorded it with that intention that it could be shared. Awesome. Thank you for putting the link to survivedandpunished.org into the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in fact, the so much of what how I understand feminist abolitionism comes from the Black women's organizing of those who are involved in Survived and Punished, like Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba, but there are so many more. So.
Amazing. Thanks to AWID again.
Thanks, AWID.
Thanks to our interpreters as well.
Thank you to our interpreters. Stuff. I want to give a shout out to Elaine Lamb, who is on the call as well, who was certainly my mentor in all of this and the impacts of criminalization on migrant sex work. Elaine is the director of Butterfly. So if you want to check out Butterfly, you can also find them online. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chanelle.
Yeah, thank you, Kai Cheng.
New moon with face. I love it.
The question was, are we on social media yet?